Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Narendra Modi has just embarked on his third term as the Prime Minister of India. When he first ran for national office, his supporters touted the Gujarat model as the success story that India as a whole needed. His opponents also feared that the same Gujarat model would transform and erode the very pillars that held up India. Now, after 20 years, how has the Gujarat model scaled up at the national level? Political scientist Christophe Jaffrelot has been studying the situation in Gujarat for many years. He's the research director at CERI-Sciences CNRS in France and professor of Indian politics and sociology at King's College London and a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the author of several books on India, most recently Gujarat Under Modi, the blueprint for today's India. We reached him in Paris soon after India's national elections and shortly before France itself went into elections. Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
In 2014, when Mr. Modi first led the BJP campaign, the Gujarat model was very much the showpiece of his campaign. He was campaigning as the Vikas Purush. And I can see a book like this, which analyzes the Gujarat model by looking at how Gujarat actually fared under Mr. Modi as chief minister, would have a certain impact, interest at that time. But you write in the foreword that the book didn't come out then because legal teams asked you to cut or change so many passages, you decided not to move forward. Now that Mr. Modi is on his third term, what conversation do you hope a book like Gujarat Under Modi can spur?
Well, I think the conversation, of course, has to be different. And the book, by the way, is different because the main theme, the main point I make there is what we see in India today was already there in Gujarat in the 2010s. And in that sense, the four pillars of Modi's Gujarat that I study in the book are the four pillars of Modi's India. And in fact, before publishing finally this book on Gujarat Under Modi, I did a book on Modi's India. And that's why I could see how the two were so much connected.
But was there something that you thought in 2010 that would get replicated but did not or didn't work nationally? Because one of the things you would often hear in 2010 is like, it's okay, that was Gujarat, but Gujarat is very different from the rest of India.
Well, not in 2010, but in 2012. In fact, in December 2012, I gave an interview to Bhargava just after the Gujarat elections. I was in Gujarat at that time, in December 2012. And by that time, I made this prediction that Narendra Modi would be the candidate for prime ministership of BJP, and that his attempt to replicate, to scale up the Gujarat model would definitely be on the agenda. Yeah, you could envision that because he was clearly looking at Delhi at that time. And in fact, the 2012 election was all directed against the Nehru Gandhi family. It was not against the Gujarat Congress.
There are many things you say that he did scale up. Is there something which he did try to scale up from the Gujarat model that didn't work nationally?
Well, one thing that he tried hard to do in Gujarat with some success was to constrain the media in a big way. By the way, after the 22 pogrom, one of the things he could not really stand was the media, was NDTV coming and reporting and so on and so forth. He has not fully succeeded in doing it at the national level because it's so much more difficult to do the same at the national level. He has tried hard, and you have the Gaudiya media now becoming the mainstream media or vice versa. But still, you have so many independent. Well, independent is not really the right word. I would say alternative media that has still continued to play a big role in the last election campaign. Clearly, the YouTube channels of Ravish Kumar and others made such a big difference. So, yes, I think that is something he has not been able to scale up.
One of the big things that was key to his success in Gujarat, because in Gujarat, he was not necessarily selling the Gujarat model. In India, he was selling the Gujarat model to India, saying, like, we can become as successful as Gujarat. But in Gujarat, what was big was this sense of Gujarat Asmita or pride, Gujarati pride. Given that, why did Gujarat not see a strong regional party emerge that was focused on Gujarat as happened in so many other states? All the attempts that happened kind of fizzled out very quickly.
Yes, no, this is the first chapter of the book. Very interestingly, the sub-nationalism we see in Gujarat, in the name of the Gujarat Asmita, is so deeply rooted in the Hindu identity that it's not so difficult to define it on the basis of Hindutva and to transpose it elsewhere. In contrast to, for instance, the Bengali subnationalism or the Maharashtrian subnationalism, which are identified in so many different regional cultures. It's really Hinduism via the Swaminarayan movement, for instance. That is the key element for defining the Gujarati Asmita. Plus, of course, a deep-rooted fear of Pakistan, fear of Islamism, that is related to a long history. Gujarat was one of the targets of the first invaders who raided Somnath and other places. Gujarat has a border with Pakistan. And in the 1965 war, it was the place where the warfare started. So you have in Gujarat a regional identity that lays itself to Hindutva in many ways. And therefore, it was not so difficult to transpose the same repertoire at the national level.
Does it surprise you then, or does it make perfect sense that somebody like a Mahatma Gandhi emerged out of Gujarat?
Well, so many people emerged out of Gujarat. Of course, we forget now, but think about the most progressive minds of India. Indulal Yagnik, who was the right-hand man of Mahatma Gandhi in Ahmedabad, a journalist by training, who became the member of parliament in Ahmedabad in 1971, 50 years after meeting Mahatma Gandhi for the first time. And who knew, this is also the first chapter of the book, who took over from him on that seat, Ehsan Jaffrey himself, and who was the main follower of Indulal Yagnik, Madhav Singh Solanki. Madhav Singh Solanki was a pioneer in positive discrimination, the CAM coalition, reservations before Mondal, 10 years before Mondal. So, yes, Gujarat now is identified with conservative, Hindutva-oriented figures because for the last 25 years they've ruled the state. But before that, and because of them, we've seen so many progressives. No, there is a dialectic between progressive politics, I would say caste politics, quota politics, and Hindutva. We see it at the national level. Since Mondal, we've seen it very clearly. It was there before. And when the Patels shifted from Congress to BJP because of reservations, they signaled something that was to become the policy of the Jats, the policies of the Marathas, the policies which made BJP so big in the 2000s.
But as you also mentioned, even in his time, Indulal Yagnik was somewhat of a lonely man in his party. And even though he was Mahatma Gandhi's right-hand man, he resigned and Gandhi accepted his resignation because, Vallabhbhai Patel was there.
Exactly. You have the two sides of the Congress coin in the 20s. And finally, Mahatma Gandhi preferred to side with Vallabhbhai Patel, who had, of course, a much more powerful position because he was the organization man and he was the one who related to the businessmen so well. that he brought money to the party.
You became famous when you called Gujarat a laboratory for Hindu nationalism, and this was in 2001. The riots had not yet happened. Why did you call it that then?
Because what you saw as early as the late 90s, never forget that everything started in the mid 90s when Keshubhai Patel became a very important leader in the state and formed the government. And you could see there that they dared to do things they had not tried to do elsewhere. Neither Rajasthan nor Madhya Pradesh. They'd been in power in these states, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, many other states. But in Gujarat, they went much further. And they went much further precisely, and this is one of the pillars of Modi's Gujarat, polarization was engineered much more effectively. The 1992 riots, of course, the 1985 riots first, but then the 1992 riot in Ahmedabad, preparing the ground for what will be the 2002 pogrom. Number two, attacks on Christians in the tribal belt. Every Christmas period in Gujarat was marked by attacks on Christians. Where did you see that at that time elsewhere in India? Nowhere. Nowhere to that extent. So polarization was clearly the, I would say, symptom of a strategy that was to be nationalized later on.
But while social polarization and communal polarization can prove effective electorally, as has been demonstrated several times in India, is that project complete in Gujarat? And this I ask because a friend of mine who's from Ahmedabad said, there are no Muslims left in many parts of Ahmedabad. They have all been sort of ghettoized in Juhapura area. So if that process of polarization is complete, then who is the other anymore?
Well, you can always invent it, the other. You can always fantasize that it is on the other side of the border. By the way, in Juhapura, as you know, there is a border. There is a road known as the border, and Juhapura is known as Little Pakistan. So even if you do not interact with the other anymore, as much as you used to do, it is there. And you can't miss the muezzin calling for azan, you can't miss some visuals at least. Yeah, you don't need to encounter the other every day for fearing the other. On the contrary, the less you know about him, the more you have a mythology that is easily built, articulated. This idea that Muslims have 5 wives, 25 children. Of course, if you interacted with them, you would realize immediately that this is just all lies. But precisely, there is not much interaction anymore.
But as you yourself say, these communal riots were certainly not unique to Gujarat. They have happened in many parts of the world. BJP will often bring up the example of 1984 and the pogrom against Sikhs after Indira Gandhi's assassination. But was 2002 and its aftermath unique in some ways compared to some of the other instances?
Well, it was at least unprecedented. Unique, I don't know. The comparison with what happened in Delhi in 1984 can certainly hold. But it was unprecedented in India, possibly, Gujarat for sure, for at least 2 reasons. First, the magnitude of this event. And when I say magnitude, I mean not only that it spread over a large number of districts, rural as well as urban. I also mean the intensity, the kind of very savage attacks on women, on children. And of course, I mean the degree of organization, because the assailants had the voters' list in their hand, they had the gas cylinders, there were many and they were well equipped. And the way Hassan Jaffrey was butchered is only one instance, the most significant one probably. But what I also mean by unprecedented is that in contrast to the 1992, 1985, 1969 riots, which were very deadly as well. Now, 69 probably also resulted in the death of 2,000 people. But in contrast to these previous events, the middle class was targeted also. So you had attacks on former High Court judges, IPS officers, IAS officers in residential areas, including Paldi, that is in Navrangpura on the other side of the river. Of course, the bulk of Muslims were in old Ahmedabad, but you had pockets of Muslim housing societies in Paldi, and they were targeted. That is something you may compare to what happened in Bombay in 1993. But it's very exceptional to see middle-class people targeted as well. And that resulted in ghettoization. Because you have a ghetto in Juapura, not because you have 500,000 Muslims. No, because you have among these Muslims, the rich and the poor. The middle-class people had to find a safe place and therefore joined the poor who were there in what was a slum in the beginning. And a ghetto is exactly that. A place that is not only remote, not only ignored by the state, of course, but a place also where the rich has to go for his safety because of his identity, because of his ethnic, ethno-religious, ethno-linguistic identity.
Are there any lessons you draw from the ghettos that exist in a place like France?
Well, the ghettos in France are mostly in the overseas islands where you have race playing a role, not so much religion. And it's a different story always because race is something you can't miss visually. I find it somewhat different when you can't make any difference between people when you see them and still they can't live together.
And in that sense, since we brought up France, in France, which is going in for snap elections, the main left-leaning Green parties are trying to come together to block the advance of the far right. And yet polls suggest that the far right could win ahead of this left-wing alliance. So in France, are you seeing what in India bloc tried to do?
Well, it's a worldwide phenomenon. All over the world, you have the rise of national populists who play on identity politics, who play on majoritarianism. And the sons of the soil can be defined on the basis of their religion, on their basis of their race, on their basis of their language, but they have to prevail over minorities and over a more universalistic definition of what is a citizen. So everywhere you have leaders who claim to be the people, but the people they claim to be is not all the people. It is the people made of the sons of the soil who happen to be in a majority, and therefore polarization is very helpful because by polarizing, you get some electoral dividend, especially in a majoritarian electoral system like the one of India and the one of France.
And in that sense, having observed Prime Minister Modi now for 10 years.
Well, for 20 years.
For 20 years. Well, 10 years as Prime Minister, I mean. When he came to power, people tried to compare him to various international leaders, whether it was Trump or Erdogan or all these people. Which comparison strikes you as most valid, or should we be making these comparisons at all?
No, we must compare. First of all, because they exchange their best practices and they are benefiting from the advice of PR companies who are very good at selling the toolkits for winning an election. This is in the book, something I mentioned, APCO Worldwide is one of them. Well, the comparison that I think is the most effective for Modi is with Erdogan, because you have a very similar background, I would say personal background. Both of them are really plebeians who started at the local level. As you know, Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul before becoming a national figure. Secondly, a very important common feature is they emerge from a very well-structured ideological movement. AKP is, of course, a party that has deep roots in Islamism, which means an ideology that is nationalistic, of course, but also very conservative. And in reaction to legacies, the legacy of Ataturk on the one hand, the legacy of Nehru on the other hand, which were by contrast very much secular. And last but not least, we have in Turkey a very similar kind of minorities, the Kurds, Christians, the Jews. So yeah, it's, I think, an interesting comparison to make. And also, Erdogan and Modi, like any national populist, has to take the risk of elections, because you can't say I am the people if you do not have the popular mandate. Therefore, they have to take this risk, and they lose some of their power after 10, 15 years. As you know, Erdogan lost many local elections lately, and Modi lost its majority.
Well, much has been made about the loss of the majority. And I wanted to ask you whether, in some ways, too much is being made of it, because in the end, on paper, the power structure has not changed. He just will have to be actually part of a coalition and depend on coalition members. But, people saying that this election proved that the Muslim as the other had limited appeal. This election proved that when people say the constitution is the product of very liberal elites and should be changed, that alarmed people. Are we overthinking that?
It's a bit early to say, and I would respond by distinguishing two different dimensions. You have the properly power-oriented dimension. Will he, Mr. Modi, lose some of his power? Will he be forced to make compromises, to make concessions, to bargain? He has never, because he has always had a full-fledged majority. Well, this is a function of what will his partners ask for, and we don't know. And will they get what they ask for? And secondly, it has a lot to do with the way other institutions, other players, will behave. Will the other power centers consider now that they can assert themselves more? Will the judiciary assert itself more? Will the bureaucrats, including the Election Commission, regain some of their autonomy? Will the Godi media realize that, now they can say things, because the risk of some authoritarian response may be less? And it's too early to say that. And I think it will very much depend on the state elections, Maharashtra, Haryana, Jharkhand, and then Bihar. The other dimension is, of course, can we interpret this election as a shift from Hindutva-dominated politics to another kind of politics? Again, it's a bit too early to say, but my sense is that we are at the end of a cycle, and a new chapter is probably on its way to be opened. Now, India's politics oscillate for 40 years between caste politics and Hindutva politics. And Hindutva is a response to Mandal, and the demand of a caste census is a response to Hindutva. There is a dialectic between the two. It will be very difficult to ignore caste politics in the coming month. It will be very difficult for Nitish Kumar, who has done a caste census himself in Bihar, not to support this demand. This demand will mount, and this demand will be very similar to the demand that was made in the 80s, 90s for reservations. Because this demand has the potential of bringing together all kinds of caste groups, which in fact are in competition. And when they'll have to share the spoils, they'll be in competition. The same way after Mandal was introduced, Yadavs and others were in competition, and finally the OBC confederation broke. But before that, they were together for getting reservations. And today, many caste groups, which have many different interests, will probably coalesce for getting this caste census, and that will make caste, back in a big way in the public debate. And this is, of course, as I've said many times, the main antidote to Hindutva. These are the fault lines, which the RSS fears so much, because how do you build the Hindu Rashtra if you have not Hindus as a bloc, but a collection of caste groups?
How did Mr. Modi manage to, we have to grant him the fact that despite everything, despite these elections, as a person, at least according to the survey, he still remains immensely popular across India. Given that, how did he manage to hold together this larger Hindu umbrella, as it were, which included so many of the OBCs, the background he comes from, in a state like Gujarat, which was always dominated by upper caste politics?
Well, in the case of Gujarat, it's very interesting indeed to see that he did not place so much on his OBC background. In fact, that's something he started to refer to in 2013, 2014, when he had to converse in BR. How do you converse in BR? When you're a Ganshi, when you are an OBC, this is the trump card you can play. But when he was in Gujarat, he attracted OBCs by referring to another concept, this idea of the neo-middle class. That's a very interesting concept. By the way, Arun Jaitley referred to this concept also when he was finance minister in 2015, when the first budget was presented. So it's a concept that has traveled to the national scene till people realized that there was nothing like a middle class, because on the contrary, inequalities were increasing. But in Gujarat, it worked. It worked in 2012 especially, because you could tell the aspiring categories, OBCs coming from the village to the city, that was the right place for a job. This is the story of the white tiger. I'm sure you know this book by Adiga. A man comes from a village, becomes a driver, and wow, it changes his lifestyle. He can have some place to stay for his own. And therefore, the caste identity was blurred. And it worked. It worked for some time. And it helped it helped Narendra Modi to get the urban vote. The urban-rural divide is fascinating in Gujarat under Modi. If Gujarat had been a rural state, Congress would have remained in office. It was one of the first urbanized states, 44% of urban dwellers already in 2011. And that was why he could win. When the same caste group, the Kolis, migrate from the village to the city, they change their vote because they feel part of the neo-middle class.
And yet, as you say, that at some point, as in Arvind Adiga's White Tiger, the driver realizes that he's still invisible to the person sitting behind him, who the people he's driving. And then he turns against them viciously, snaps. Now, we can say that's a novel, that's fiction, that's the writer's prerogative. But do you see signs of that happening in Gujarat? Because if, as you say, truly Gujarat saw growth without development, growth without commensurate good jobs, why would the BJP keep such a super majority? Eventually, the white tigers would be even more resentful about seeing all the highways and ports come up, but their life is not improving.
Well, two things there. One, the anger has been diverted to the Muslims, and the Muslim is the scapegoat. That is now targeted. People thinking that they are pampered, they are protected. We will very soon publish a survey we've done with the CSDS Lokniti during the elections, showing that a large proportion of Hindus continue to believe that Muslims have been pampered in spite of everything. Every statistical information will tell you Muslims are the poorest of all the groups. Still, it holds. The mindset has not changed. So that's one explanation. The other explanation is, how do you fight BJP in Gujarat? How do you do that? All the resources are on one side. The money, of course. The media, of course. Any leader who emerges is co-opted. Hardik Patel, Thakur. There is no congressman who has not been allured. And this is part of the Gujarat model that you see at the national level, either because of the carrot or because of the stick. Politicians shift from opposition to the BJP. Now, the carrot, we know it, will give you a ticket. You may have even a portfolio. The stick, we know it, ED raids, IT raids. There are so many possibilities. So we are in a situation where to be in the opposition, to compete, to contest, has become almost impossible. And the main question for me is, the main pillars of Modi's strategy in Gujarat have been replicated at the national level. Can that development also be replicated? And that's where probably you can't scale up the Gujarat model. That's too difficult.
So in terms of the other pillars, can you talk a little bit about the other pillars that you feel have been replicated at a national level?
Yeah. Well, polarization is the number one pillar, and I don't need to elaborate on that. Clearly, it was a way to create a Hindu vote bank. We always speak about the Muslim vote bank or the X or Y vote bank. Well, the Hindu vote bank is the number one vote bank. And that was something that polarization helped to build by creating animosity, by creating violence between communities. And as I show in the book, the map of BJP's successful candidates in 2002 is the map of the pogrom. The places where the pogrom affected the most the people were the places where Hindus voted en masse for BJP.
And in fact, let me stop you there. There's one quote in the book which really struck me about that time where KPS Gill, the officer, said, riots have happened many times in India and many places. And he said he was disturbed by the absence of the Kalinga effect in Gujarat after the riots, which is, of course, the allusion to the remorse supposedly felt by Emperor Ashok on the battlefield of Kalinga.
The main thing you could heard at that time was they've been totally listened. The fear of the Muslim was so deep-rooted and also fostered by the way the Mafia, the Muslim Mafia, Abdul Latif and others, were projected by the Sangh Parivar.
But it was a reality, right? It's not just that they were created as boogeymen. They were mafia bootleggers, running little parallel empires.
With the police. And this is precisely the very interesting second pillar. Capture of institutions, number one, the police. A police that has always been complicated in Gujarat, partly because of this connection with the Mafia, including Abdul Latif. When you look at the book by Julio Ribeiro, when he was the chief of the Gujarat police, he discovered a universe he had never seen before. So after the pogrom, that's what Narendra Modi managed to do, to capture the police by sidelining policemen who had done their job properly and promoted those who had let the violence develop. And you've seen in this context a very important development, a series of fake encounters. As you may remember, Sohrabuddin was one of them, but there were many other cases. Between 2003 and 2007, there were at least a dozen of cases of fake encounters, with the police, including Vanzara and others, very much implicated. The police became an instrument of the government for a politics of fear.
Isn't that true everywhere in India? I live in Bengal, and the BJP as the opposition is constantly complaining about how Mamata Banerjee's government uses the police.
Certainly, but there is a difference there because the argument was these people have been killed by the police because they had come from Pakistan as jihadists to kill Narendra Modi. So there was a PR dimension. Vanzara giving press conferences for justifying politically this kind of fake encounters. And therefore you have a kind of politics of fear that helped BJP to keep the pot boiling. To keep the pot boiling is a phrase that Sudha Pai and her co-author uses about UP. You can use it during the phase of fake encounters in Gujarat. That's one institution that was captured. And as I said, this is something you can see at the national level. And you remember that a CBI chief has been replaced because he was not of the liking of the government. By the way, many IPS officers have traveled with Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah from Gujarat to Delhi. Not only IPS officers, by the way, there were also IAS officers. A kind of institutional capture that resulted in the making of a coterie. That's the second pillar, very important. The third pillar, of course, is the political economy of Gujarat. Gujarat has always been well known for business. This is the place from where so many tycoons of India come from. But it was also a state where you had a very dense network of SMEs, entrepreneurs. And Patels were the first caste group moving from the village to the city and sometimes going overseas as well as entrepreneurs. With Narendra Modi, we see a transformation with support for the big ones and support for mega projects. Mega projects means what? Special economic zones where land is very cheap, where there is no labor laws, no taxation almost. Also sometimes 0.1% interest rate for the investors. And of course, the nano story is well known. It's one of the symbols of this, but the most important symbol is, of course, the rise of Gautam Adani. And Gautam Adani was given the SEZ of Mundra in 2003 after defending Narendra Modi against other businessmen. In the Confederation of Indian Industry in 2002, there were people who were very critical of the way Narendra Modi had behaved in 2002. Mr. Bajaj, Mr. Godrej, and Gautam Adani came to his rescue and helped him from day one and was rewarded and is still rewarded till today for this. So you have a new political economy taking shape with a kind of oligarchy that is being made. What is an oligarchic system? It's a system where the political leader makes concessions, gives some undue advantages, benefits to a businessman who in return will pay for his expenditures, will pay for his trips abroad, will pay for his election campaign. That's what we have in Gujarat, and that's exactly what we have in India. So many years later, the same system and the electoral bonds were just a way to magnify this.
But at the same time, every leader also wants to be known for creating jobs. I mean, they want that on their resume. And Gujarat, as you said, is a state that is known for its entrepreneurs, small-time businesses. Why would a political leader kind of give them the short shrift in order to quote the top big industrialists to create mega projects that are not going to generate mega jobs?
This is where identity politics does the job. For many years, the socioeconomic issues could be on the back burner because the reasons why you voted BJP was not jobs or education or health. Gujarat's records in terms of education and health are among the worst in India. In spite of the richness of the state, no money has been invested in these public goods. So you need this kind of distraction. I call it a distraction. That is in Dodva, ethno-religious repertoires for precisely making inequalities sustainable, for making people, thinking about something else, voting for other reasons. And again, it's not in India only. The Turkish economy is in a very bad shape for years, but the voters support Erdogan for other reasons, for ethno-nationalistic reasons. So that's the third pillar. And the fourth, of course, is Narendra Modi himself. A style that is national populist to the core. It's very interesting to see how as early as 2007, he decided to create a parallel power structure for not relying on the RSS, for not relying on the Sangh Parivar. As early as 2007, he had broken with Vishwa Hindu Parishad, with the Bharatiya Kisan Sangh, and he did not report to the Pran Pracharak, Manmohan Vaid, who had to leave to Chennai, because he wanted to be his own master. He wanted to relate to the people directly. And this is what the populist does, to relate to the people directly, circumventing, short-circuiting its own party, its own institution. By the way, in his own party, there were dissidents. Mr. Kishubhai Patel was trying hard to, win the state election, the party elections. And he was sidelined the same way L.K. Advani will be sidelined after 2014. You don't use intermediaries. You use social media. You use holograms. You use Prashant Kishore. You use the professional marketer. And it was national populism also because it was all about identity. It was all about Pakistan. There was no election campaign in Gujarat without very heavy references to the threat that Pakistan was posing on India. And of course, the subtext was Islamism and the subtext was Islam. So this style was very much invented in Gujarat. Narendra Modi was not a politician in 2001. He had never been elected. He had no idea of how you win an election. So he learned quickly. 2002, of course, the first election campaign, and then 2007, and then 2012, where Prashant Kishore and with the holograms and so on. That is exactly what we will see after 2014. Well, 2014, 2019, Balakot, after the attack of Pulwama, same frenzy and same capacity to relate directly to the people. The Namo channels, that is something, by the way, invented also in Gujarat, a specific TV channel. And then the Twitter handle, Main Chokidar B or Modi Ki Parivar. No, that's a style you find with Bolsonaro, you find with Trump, you find with Erdogan, you find with Duterte, you find with Orban, you find with Kaczynski, you find with Netanyahu. This is what the PR companies are so good at selling across the world, and they learn from each other.
But when you come out as a populist leader, as you mentioned in the book, you have to have this elite establishment that you are railing against. And this is what Trump did so successfully against Hillary Clinton. But you need that outside. You need to be outside the establishment, knocking at the Nehru Gandhi or whatever is the establishment. After 10 years in power as prime minister, what does a populist do? Aren't you the establishment now, in some ways, in people's eyes?
Well, the same way Trump had to invent a very powerful liberal clique based on the two coasts, East Coast, West Coast. Modi had to magnify the Khan Market gang, the Louiston's elite, a very tiny and really not so powerful group. But you need to build on that. And the same thing happened in Gujarat. Most of the election campaigns, at least 2007, 2012, as I show in the book, were not directed against the Gujarat congressman. It was all about New Delhi and the Nehru Gandhi family. The most derogatory words were used against Sonia and Rahul and Manmohan Singh, who was called Monmohan Singh, as you may remember. And they described Delhi as Delhi Sultanate. So he realized very soon, as a good populist, that he needed an enemy at the top of the establishment. And as a chief minister of Gujarat, he targeted Delhi all the time. The liberals were certainly not that many, but it was a kind of invention or illusion that he could create. It's all about rhetoric.
And the liberal establishment sometimes delivered that discourse to him by sneering at him as a chaiwala and making comments like that, which he very cleverly pivoted.
Of course, no, Modi had this amazing quality of being a Pakka Sanghi from the OBCs. He was the first one. There were others, Chauhan, Kalyan Singh, but he was such a great communicator in contrast to them both. He is a pure product of RSS. So that's what they do. They know how to be disciplined and organized.
And I've been to his rallies, and I can see how the crowd would lap up his sarcasm, some things where, people, the liberal elite, the Khan Market gang would be like, oh my God, you can't say that out in public. And like Trump, he dares to and gets an enormous response. And so that's a way you prove that you're down with the people.
Exactly. In spite of all the glasses or watches you're wearing and luxury goods always, you can, with your discourse, like Trump, be like the people because you speak the way the people speak. Claim, I'm one of you, and I'm one of you against the establishment. This is the way he could sell demonetization. Demonetization was seen in the UP election campaign 2017 as something he did for the poor.
And as you talk in the book, there's Hindutva, but there's Moditva, the brand that Narendra Modi creates. And Modi one day will depart office, in the natural course of things. Do you think it was all about Modi, or was in the last 10 years, these pillars that you talked about, the changes in the institutions are going to be much more hard to roll back than just the figure of one person?
Well, difficult to say, but of course, erosion of institutions are a damage not so easy to overcome as time passes. We saw that in neighboring states. We saw that in neighboring countries. Some of these countries never recovered. A point of no return may be reached when you believe in your own lies, when you do not know your history because the textbooks have been completely transformed, when you do not know the other because you don't live with him anymore. That is quite possible.
But we are not there yet, you're saying?
No, I don't think India is yet there. No, because of diversity in the first place. It's, of course, so large, so diverse. But what we'll have to watch very closely is, will a change of guard at the top, will any alternation in power make also society change? Or will we see alternation in power, the opposition winning elections, and at the grassroots level, minorities, victims of vigilante groups still? This is for me the key concern. There can be a kind of decoupling between the political scene that may play the democratic game and at the same time such a change at the local level, at the grassroots level, that in fact for the minorities it makes no difference.
We'll have to see that. But before I let you go, I was just curious, because in the dedication of this book, you dedicated to someone who introduced you to India. And I was just curious, what drew you as a French academic to India and made you persist all these years with it?
Well, the people of India. And I would say all kinds. Some of my best friends are in India. Some of my most moving encounters with human beings have been in India. I've worked, as you know, with Dalits, Maharashtra in particular, with Muslims, Gujarat in particular, and of course, those who are in the Khan Market gang, liberals. And of course, you say as an academic, well, as an academic, where else did you find such a vibrant intellectual dynamism? Where else do you have the subaltern studies? Where else do you have, institutions like the CSDS, like GNU? In the 90s, in the 2000s, you could feel that was intellectually very challenging, very stimulating. And so you had the human dimension, but also the intellectual dimension. And my fear is that has been, of course, badly affected by, the way academic freedom has been damaged. And that is not so easy to rebuild.
Some people will say that the fact that your book is coming out now, better late than never, is proof that that space for dissent still exists.
And because of the courage of few individuals. And this is for me, I did a book on the emergency with Pratinav Anil. The book on the emergency showed something we see today. You may have institutions, only people matter. You may have a Supreme Court, only the personality of the judges matter. You can make work an institution, or you can let it die. And it's true for publishing. All the publishers who had turned down this book have been a disgrace to their profession, but there are still people who are prepared to take the risk.
Christophe Jaffrelot, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandip.
Christophe Jaffrelot is the research director at CERI-Sciences CNRS in France and professor of Indian politics and sociology at King's College London. He's the author of several books on India, most recently, Gujarat Under Modi, The Blueprint for Today's India. The show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.